Hello, everyone. It's Brian with you. About, well, I'm not sure when, several months ago, I received a comment on one of my videos from someone encouraging me to make a video about John Cale, and that immediately piqued my interest because I'm a big John Cale fan. And in that video, I had mentioned something about John Cale. I showed either a book or maybe this book I have right here or a record. I'm not sure which, but I thought that was a really good idea. Any opportunity for me to make a video on John Cale would be great. However, I didn't do it because I was trying to figure out how I would do one video on John Cale, because it seems to me that that video would be way too long. But I decided then to do several videos on John Cale. So that's bad news if you don't like John Cale. Good news maybe if you do. And the good news is that I intend to keep them relatively short, so 10 to 12 minutes each, maybe less depending on the topic. And I thought I would just go through what I have related to him and that kind of thing. So I suppose most people watching this would already know that John Cale, of course, was a founding member of the Velvet Underground, along with Lou Reed, Sterling Morrison, and Maureen Tucker. I think that's fairly well known, especially for people in the vinyl community. That's pretty obvious. He also has some notoriety as a producer, so having produced people like the Stooges, Modern Lovers, Nico in particular, Jesus the Lizard, Susie and the Banshees, things like that. So there's quite a long list of production credits that he has. I consider him to be sort of a musical chameleon because his early days he was classically trained, and during his tenure with the Velvet Underground you would describe him as maybe the darker side of the Velvet Underground. You know, he brought that sort of droning sound and those thudding keyboards to the mix. Very interesting sound. But since then he's released what would be considered pop records, rock records, and again a return to classical sounds with some of his soundtrack work. So kind of all over the map. I think he's a brilliant musician, still alive. He put an album out this year. He's now 81. I think he's 81. Yeah. So coming up to 82. So yeah, really interesting guy. So what I thought I would do is just give an introduction to this plan of mine and see how it goes. Now I mentioned he's born in Wales, and I am going to refer to some notes here just casually because, as you probably have guessed, I'm an old guy now and I can't remember things. But on the topic of biographies and information about John Cale, I will mention this book called What's Welsh for Zen, written by John Cale and Victor Brockus. And this came out in 1999. The autobiography of John Cale, What's Welsh for Zen, 1999. So it takes a story of his life up until 1999. And it's a very, very good book. It has a lot of images, etc., information about his life. It's really great. I recommend it. If you can find it and you're a fan, I would recommend you get that. And of course, for the major outlines, of his life, Wikipedia is fairly good. It has the major events there. So let's just start with where he's from. Born in Wales in March 1942 in a small town called Garnant. I don't know where that is. Oh, by the way, I should mention one thing. And I've mentioned this before when I talked about this book. The opening of this book always makes me, I don't know if it's really chuckle or what, but this is the first three sentences. I was born on March 9th, 1942 in Garnant, between Swansea and Carmarthen, South Wales. Some 3,000 miles away in Brooklyn, New York, Lewis Reed had been born 1 week earlier on the 2nd. I knew he always had an edge on me. I find that sort of interesting and kind of a little bit sad in a way because, whenever you mention Lou Reed, especially whenever you mention John Cale, you think of Lou Reed. There's no question about that. The other way around, maybe, but certainly when you talk about John Cale, Lou Reed is going to come up. So to have him acknowledge that on the first page is quite interesting. Now, he speaks Welsh because apparently his mother spoke Welsh to him. His father was a coal miner. He joined the National Youth Orchestra of Wales because he had acclaim as a young viola player. And so that part of his life was all classical music and whatnot. But he made the decision to come to New York in 1963 to work with Aaron Copland, which he did. And in New York, he met a whole host of interesting people like John Cage, Terry Riley, Lamont Young, Angus MacLeese, all these kinds of interesting people, and of course eventually Lou Reed. He took part in a 18-hour and 40-minute concert at some point that became quite famous. And eventually he joined Lamont Young's ensemble called the Theatre of Eternal Music, which is sometimes known as the Dream Syndicate. Now, I think there's another band called the Dream Syndicate, but this is the original one. And that group or that ensemble was known for producing heavily drone-laden instrument music pieces, and many of them were unreleased for years because of copyright issues or claims of ownership and that kind of thing. There were some recordings that came out in the early 2000s, and many videos down the line. If I continue to do this, I will pull those out inside the Dream Syndicate series. But the interesting thing is eventually he met Lou Reed and they formed the Velvet Underground together. So as I said, the Velvet Underground kind of like, for me, the first two records are clearly the best two records because they feature John Cale, of course. And then he left or was kicked out or departed somehow, and the band continued without him. One thing I should mention is that, and I mentioned this quite recently, the tie-in with Leonard Cohen is quite interesting to me because Leonard Cohen is another of my favorite artists. And recently I mentioned this story that when the I'm Your Fan record was being prepared or was in planning, John Cale elected to sing Hallelujah, which was a song that appeared on Leonard Cohen's Various Positions record. Now that record famously was not released in the United States because the record company didn't like it. But in preparing the song, John Cale contacted Leonard Cohen and asked him for the lyrics, and Leonard Cohen sent him a fax with 15 pages of lyrics. So he'd written far more lyrics than he ever used. And in fact, the album version of that song is quite different from versions he sang later. He kept the first verse and pretty much everything else he changed. But John Cale went through the lyrics and he created an arrangement that suited him and put that on the I'm Your Fan record. It showed up in the Shrek movie, but on the soundtrack they replaced it with the Rufus Wainwright version. But after Cale's version was released, Jeff Buckley released a version of that song. This is a story I probably should save until later, but I'm doing it now. And what's interesting to me is that John Cale's version was covered by Jeff Buckley. So you would think that Jeff Buckley would have covered Leonard Cohen's version, but he covered John Cale's version. This is a large digression, but if you're interested in that, you should look at this book, The Holy or the Broken. Leonard Cohen, Jeff Buckley, and the Unlikely Ascent of Hallelujah. And in here, there's lots of mention of John Cale and John Cale's version of that song and whatnot. That was a digression. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Velvet Underground because that's sort of been done to death. I will show you what I have of the Velvet Underground that features John Cale, and then we'll move on. But let me just do that part first. So the Velvet Underground and Nico, of course. This is a classic record, 1967. This is my Canadian pressing, probably from the early 80s. There's no date on this, and Discogs doesn't know, but this has kind of a disarming opening track because it's Sunday morning and you think that this is going to be a pleasant listen, but then it goes into like I'm Waiting for the Man. We have Venus and Furs. On side 2 we have Heroin. We have the Black Angels Death Song. So it's quite a weird record because it has that sort of the Nico tracks, which are more pleasant maybe, and then these sort of hardcore droney things. You can see John in the middle here. So this is a great record, and of course in the next year, 1968, the band followed up with White Light, White Heat. You'd think I'd know that by now. And of course I didn't know these when I was younger because I was not aware of music at the time, but of course this has more of the same early droney, really great, I don't know what to say, music from the Velvet Underground featuring the 17 minutes of Sister Ray on side 2, and The Gift, the spoken word John Cale track. So this is really, really excellent. And for me, that's the two best Velvet Underground records. But he did appear on other things. So, for example, this record called View contains some lost tracks from the Velvet Underground. And there are 2 tracks on here that feature John as a musician and backing vocals, Stephanie Says, and Temptation Inside Your Heart. So those are on here. That came out in 1984. In 1986, and I should say these are all my Canadian pressings, Another View came out, and there are 3 tracks on here. Hey Mr. Rain, the version 1 and version 2, and then Guess I'm Falling in Love, the instrumental version, feature John Cale, even though this is the post-John Cale era. I also have this, I'm showing this because it's kind of unusual, it's this Velvet Underground EP, which has Heroin, Venus and Furs, I'm Waiting for the Man, and Run, 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 which is really interesting. I've never ever seen another copy of this, apart from the one I bought when I saw it in a store. So it came out in the 80s. There's no date on here. No, 1982, even though it dates to 1967. The tracks came out in 1982. I guess, I don't know why. Was it trying to rekindle interest in the Velvet Underground? Who knows? And of course, famously in early 1990s, they reformed for a tour. So this is the resulting full concert. This has there's four LPs on here, and they're on this blue vinyl with this bananas. So that came out in 1993. So you can see the original lineup. They toured parts of Europe. I think the intention was, this was recorded in Paris, the intention was they would bring the tour back to North America, but that never happened. So this, I'm not sure if this got excellent reviews, but I think it's quite good. I mean, it's fun to hear them playing. They sound really great. And it's too bad they didn't do the tour over here. And of course now there's only 2 original members left because Lou Reed died years ago and Sterling Morrison has passed away. So it's just Mo and John who remain, sadly. And then there's this weird thing, this oddity, Velvet Underground, the Scepter Sessions. Now this was something they recorded in April 25th, 1966 to acetate, and it ended up being lost, and somebody from Montreal actually paid something like 25 cents for it at a flea market in New York City, and later sold it for $25,000, I think. And in 2013 or maybe 14, it was released on vinyl. So what this is really alternate, well, I guess you'd say early versions of the songs that appeared on the first record. So it's actually interesting to listen. It's a bit rough, and acetate is not maybe the best preservation format, so there are some what might sound like surface noise, but probably is just noise from the acetate. So it's actually really interesting if you're a big fan. And then finally, the other thing that I have that John Cale appears on, of course, is this soundtrack to the documentary about the Velvet Underground that was done by Todd Haynes from, what year was this? 2021, quite recently. And of course, that documentary focuses on the early Velvet Underground. So there are some Velvet Underground tracks on here. There is some other things that sort of fit into the sound, to sort of fit into the movie, like the Bo Diddley track. And then there's something called 17-12-63 New York City, The Fire is a Mirror, an excerpt from that. And that's from the Theater of Eternal Music. That's the 3rd track on here. And it's actually quite interesting. And I remembered when I just pulled this out that there's a quote from, there's a thing from Lester Bangs here, and it says, "Modern music," Lester Bangs famously wrote, "begins with the Velvet Underground." And I think that's probably right. I mean, Brian Eno said something similar. For example, something like, very few people heard the Velvet Underground, but those who did all started a rock band, or something along those lines, which I find really interesting. For me, like a really important band, and that started my interest in John Cale, which continues to this day. So what I plan to do is to do a series of videos about John Cale, and they're not going to be one after the other. I'll give some breathing room around them, but I will go through his discography. I have almost everything that he's released, with a couple of exceptions, and many of the things he released, especially some soundtracks, were not released on vinyl. So I'll cover CDs and vinyl releases, and I'm going to give my assessment on whether I think the album in question is essential or not. And before I do this, I haven't done it already, I'm going to guess that there's probably 10 or so, maybe 11 records that I'm going to say are essential to any music fan. And then there are some that are maybe optional. And I'm going to cover all the collaborations he did, for example, with Terry Riley and Brian Eno and Lou Reed and Bob Newirth and those kinds of things. I'll cover those too. And hopefully the videos will be shorter than this, because I'm already at almost 15 minutes, and hopefully I'll keep them to 10 minutes. But thanks for watching, and yeah, I'll see what happens with this. I'll talk to you later.